Hello, everybody. Hello, Emily and Milan. So this is one of the conversations in our series of conversations related to the project Sciences of the Origin. I'm Slobodan Perović and I am principal investigator in that project. The project is funded by the John Templeton Foundation and realized through the Ian Ramsey Center for Science and Religion at the University of Oxford. And we had quite a few very interesting people in archaeology, in paleontology, in philosophy of cognitive sciences, all dealing with somewhat similar issues of sort of approaching scientific and philosophical subjects that concern the origins of mind, of human mind, the origin of the universe and the origin of life. Today with me are Emily Parke and Milan Ćirković. Emily is senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Auckland, and she's also a member of the executive committee of the Te Ao Marama, if I pronounce that well, Center for Fundamental Inquiry. And she's also an associate editor of Biology and Philosophy, which is sort of a leading journal in philosophy of biology. Her work is very interesting and touches on several related, I would say, subjects: microbiome research, scientific modeling, and astrobiology, conservation biology. She also worked on a precautionary principle in biology, in microbiology, which touches on something that Milan has been working on for quite a while now. And her work in the origins of life and philosophical issues surrounding the origins of life is really what motivated sort of me to approach Emily, and now I will address you directly, Emily. So the sort of a triggering moment for me was the paper that's coming out actually in the collection, edited by a few scientists, I guess, conflicting models for the origin of life, in the volume in the series of astrobiology perspectives. And the title of the paper is Characterizing Life: 4 Dimensions and Their Relevance to the Origin of Life. It's a very interesting sort of a summation of the work in the origin of life, biology, and sort of with an eye of a really sharp philosopher trying to kind of make sense of all these diverse theories. So that's one of the topics that we will talk about. But before that, let me introduce Milan. Milan Ćirković is a colleague and a friend of mine. He's a research professor at the Astronomical Observatory of Belgrade and also research associate at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. Some of the topics that he's been working on are astrobiology, cosmology, theory of risk, and he edited Global Catastrophic Risks with Bostrom in 2008. He has other books, but I will emphasize the astrobiological landscape that came out in 2012 with Cambridge University Press. You can actually see that book here. It's a very nice introduction to the informative introduction to the subject. So I would like actually to open this conversation with the question that sort of comes to mind when you ask philosophers about sort of life and what life really is. One of the tendencies among philosophers for the last, I don't know, maybe 100 years, is to try and define something by providing necessary and sufficient conditions. So one way to waste your philosophical career is to kind of, try to define something with such strict criteria. And I'm pretty sure that we will agree that that's not really the best way to do it. But I mean, the question remains, what is actually life, as biology has kind of accounted for it? And before that, maybe Emily can tell us very quickly what is actually, how would you actually define philosophy of biology, or sort of not define, characterize? What is the kind of main mission of the discipline, if there is such a thing?
Wow, well, in philosophy of biology as a whole, I mean, I guess one of the main ideas is looking at conceptual issues in the life sciences, broadly construed, and I like this term that's come up in some recent discussions in philosophy of conceptual engineering. I think that sort of nicely captures what a lot of philosophers of biology do. I think, at least the way I do it in my own research, when done well, it engages with actual work in the life sciences, looking at concepts that are thorny and debates that might rest on thorny concepts and trying to help clarify those. So a lot of my own research sort of falls in that category of thinking about tricky concepts in the life sciences and ways that we might clarify them. And I'm especially interested in tricky concepts that big debates or explanatory puzzles rest on. And that's one reason I find the discussion about life so fascinating.
Yes, so one of the things that you actually did, and it's fairly new, I would say, in philosophy of biology, maybe goes back 15, 20 years, is philosophy of microbiology, or sort of focus on microbiology. And one of the very interesting sort of philosophical aspects of that research, to me at least, has been the attempts to understand the sort of individuality of life. What is actually an individual in the living matter in bacterial colonies, and that goes to the issue of, I mean, the example that's often used in that area are archaebacteria and the way that they are different with lateral transfer of genes, and how their colonies can be characterized as sort of superorganisms. So could you just sort of give us a little, like, where does that sort of research stands at the moment, as far as, because it's, at least my impression is, it's fairly new compared to the sort of typical work that was done in philosophy of biology on evolutionary theory and sort of the details of figuring out certain concepts that drive that theory.
Yeah, and a lot of my work in that area has been in collaboration with Maureen O'Malley, who wrote this wonderful paper with John Dupre at least 10 or 15 years ago now, called Size Doesn't Matter, Towards a New Philosophy of Biology, where they push for philosophers of biology to look more closely at microbes. There's a long tradition, partly for historical reasons, of philosophers of biology focusing on animals like ourselves and other so-called charismatic megafauna, things we can see with the naked eye that are interesting to look at and think about intuitively. And there hasn't been as much focus on microbes. And when philosophers asking questions about the living world turn their eye to microbes as a central example, it challenges all sorts of standard views and raises fascinating new ones. So a famous one is the idea of species. There's this sort of classic understanding of species as interbreeding populations that is quite easy to apply to mammals and animals. And when we look at the microbial world, that's completely undermined and we need to rethink it. And so individuality is another one, as you mentioned.
Yes, and that, for me, actually, in a way, that was the entry sort of point to the questions of the origin of life, because it seemed to me that because at a sort of a macro level, or like level of vertebrates and mammals, and what we usually deal with when we talk about the evolutionary theory, I mean, one step sort of further in terms of understanding the kind of individual and kind of a whole in biology was really looking at the microorganisms and the ways in which they are sort of specific, let's say. But then it seemed to me that if we push that issue even further, we will then sort of almost naturally ask questions about the all other forms of life that preceded the sort of life as we know it now, and naturally the questions about the kind of life that existed at the very beginnings rather of life. So I mean, this is sort of a question for both Milan and for you. So how do you think are these two questions? What is actually life, which is sort of a question that typically philosophers will ask, and the question of the origin of life. Are they really inherently related? Do we have to answer both? Is there some kind of a sort of a circularity? It doesn't have to be sort of a bad circularity necessarily, but what is your sort of a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are related questions. I think plenty of people can and do ask and address the question, what is life, without trying to answer the question of how life originated. So if our goal is just to look for life on other planets in the universe, or just to try to create lifelike systems and software, we might be able to do that while dancing around, if not completely avoiding the question of how it actually originated on Earth, or how it could, in principle, originate anywhere. I'm not sure that we can address questions about life's origin without at least some assumptions about answers to the question, what is life, in the background? And I think some origin of life researchers explicitly address that question. And my sense is that many others, even if they're not taking the explicit stake in the debate about the nature of life, are relying on assumptions about the best way to answer that question.
Yeah, so I mean, then we sort of come now to the sort of astrobiological aspect of these questions. I mean, if we think about it, one way to think, I don't know if philosophers typically will do that, but one way to think about it is to really try to kind of speculatively almost, I mean, start from the conditions that define life as we know it, and that we reconstructed in evolutionary terms from the sort of remnants and then fossils that we have, and then try to see how far can we actually push these conditions, molecular sort of conditions, what would be these kind of other forms of life, the molecular level, at the level of thermodynamic conditions driving life, also in terms of, just recognizing life in terms of, as an individual sort of a thing, or as a kind of a whole. So my question, it's sort of a very broad question. How far do you think we can go with this sort of, and is it a worthwhile endeavor to try and figure out actually these boundaries of plausibility, if you wish? Maybe Milan can.
Okay, listen, the issue is, I mean, there are several issues there. I mean, but first of all, let me go a little step back, make a little step back, and just as a kind of devil's advocate, suggest that actually we are not yet in position to try to offer, for instance, some perfectly philosophically satisfactory account of, definitional account of life, because after all, in as far as history of science usually teaches us, we reach some kind of formalization of a field, including definitions, usually at the end of our research enterprise, not at the beginning, because consider, for instance, my favorite example is that are those, because there are many examples from mathematics, because mathematical entities usually are always implied to require precise definitions, exact knowing all necessary and sufficient conditions. But that was not, in fact, the case for most of the history of mathematics, which is like, I don't know, like 6,000 years long or something like that. So actually people didn't know what a number is for like 99% of the history of mathematics. And we really don't fault them for that. Really, actually, we think that their achievements with numbers were even greater because they knew much less than we know now, after we introduced some more general concepts and ideas like sets and classes and other things which are basically underpinning our modern definitions of number. Because after all, the definition to define what a number is was possible only in 1920s and 1930s, if I remember well, with works of people like Russell and Frege and Post and Church and Turing and other guys who came just atop of a vast mountain of results, obviously, during all those thousands of years of history of mathematics, which were completely successful in reaching magnificent results. And we don't ask, I don't know, if we could have some time machine and go to the time of Archimedes or Newton or Gauss or Cauchy or whichever great mathematician from history, we wouldn't really fault them and, you know, accuse them. I mean, how can you do this and that if you are not completely sure formally what a number is, what a real number or imaginary number or whatever complex number is. So actually, the very development of the theories of life, including those in molecular biology on a level of biochemistry and molecular biology on one hand, and those in astrobiology, on the other hand, when we take account this spatial and temporal extension of our very limited terrestrial experience, will actually enable us, in my view, at some point to develop more general and more generally applicable concepts, which we then use in offering completely satisfactory formal definition of life. And this might also proceed as a kind of byproduct of our laboratory research on abiogenesis or on the origin of life, or even as a byproduct of our research in the domain of computer science or artificial life in a kind of a digital medium.
Yes.
I don't see that big pressure in a kind of, there is some, from time to time it seems that there is some sort of urgency in our attempts to define life. I don't really think it's justified, because after all people who are involved in real day-to-day research have some kind of intuitive concept of what they are working on. And this is obviously what most of people in most scientific disciplines have had for like centuries before, until their disciplines were kind of formalized and kind of understood.
So in a way, what you're saying is that really we need to kind of spread the domain of all these characterizations of life that seem sort of defining in some sense. They may not be in the end neither necessary nor sufficient for all life, but we need to define these kind of clusters, and then one day, you know, a long time ahead in the future, we will be able maybe to come up with sort of a very formal and maybe very reductive definition of life. Is that what sort of
yeah, I think that would be a fair assessment.
Yeah. do you, Emily, have anything to add to this?
Yeah. I mean, so in the chapter that you mentioned earlier, I intentionally avoid the term definition after the first few paragraphs when I say why, for exactly the sort of reason you're talking about. I think, as you said at the outset of our discussion, a lot of this literature is focused on defining life. And I think some people in these discussions, especially philosophers, have in mind strict, necessary, and sufficient conditions when they say defining life. But I think a lot of people, especially some of the scientists involved in these discussions, mean definition more loosely in the sense of a working definition or what others have called an operational definition. So I think characterization kind of captures strict definitions, but also working characterizations, models, heuristics, and these are the sorts of things that, as you say, guide theory development in its earlier stages. Carol Cleland has this nice way of putting one of the points that also came up here, which is that so far, all of our theorizing about life is based on a single sample of life, which sounds like a strange thing to say, but the idea is that it's all of life as we know it so far shares a common ancestor. So however diverse it is, there's some sense in which the question of how far we can push our theorizing about its boundaries is limited by this current sample.
Yeah, so one of the questions that you sort of touched on there is if we think about the ways in which we come up with these characterizations, kind of, not really necessary and sufficient conditions, but in terms of projects in astrobiology, one will have to at some point decide if want to do sort of realize a mission, some kind of a search, observations. You will have to, at the end of the day, say, well, what's the common denominator to everything that I think life might be, in a way. So, in a sense, although, I mean, I agree in general what Milan said, I would say that one would have to sort of search at least for a kind of something that's common, something that is kind of a necessary characterization of living entities. And so one of the examples of that sort of very fresh, recent example is attempt to try and do the sort of spectral analysis of very complex molecules. So that's one way to kind of search for life on other planets, to look for complex molecules. But then the question is that something that we can actually, agree on, or sort of maybe challenge? Or, I mean, it sounds like a very reasonable sort of proposal, of course.
Oh, it is reasonable, but the thing is that one should be completely aware of limitations of such approach. Of course, I mean, people usually don't want to advertise limitations due to, I don't know, search for funding or whatever. But the thing is that obviously that's similar to the experiences we have had like 40 years ago with the Viking experiments on Mars. The Viking probe was sent on Mars on the basis of a fairly reasonable kind of low profile assumption that potential Martian microbes will have a metabolism which is fairly similar to what we expect on Earth. And the results, not only the experimental setup, but also our approach to interpreting results of a Viking mission, which was, as we all know, very controversial and in a sense remains controversial to this day, to be quite honest, because there are still people thinking of serious people, astrobiologists, who actually do think that, at least two of them I know of, which do think that that the Viking actually discovered Martian microscopic biosphere. that the signals obtained, their interpretation, their reading of the Viking results is that actually it is consistent with small concentration of such and such bacteria or whatever. I don't want to go into details there. But the thing is that both the way we actually invested, and it was at the time, it was the most expensive space mission by that time, ever. Okay, excepting human space flight, but without humans, it was the most expensive space mission so far. The very way people invested such huge funds into construction of the experimental setup, and what subsequently was done with the results was actually a function of those philosophical, essentially, assumptions about what particular feature do we expect of microscopic living organisms do we expect to be common for two very different astrophysical locales like Earth and Mars. So actually, this is a question of great practical import. That one should be quite clear from the beginning. So we actually, most of those searches for biosignatures which you mentioned actually rely on some fairly simple, again, rather low-profile assumptions about metabolism of potential other biospheres. So when they say, okay, there will be some like methanogens or maybe some photosynthetic creatures creating free oxygen, which otherwise doesn't exist in the universe. These are assumptions which are made on a basis of some kind of implicit working definition of what we expect to find. Yeah. And so these things are limited by our working definitions.
Yeah, that's exactly, that sort of brings us to the issue that in a way motivated this whole project that we have, that if you're dealing with the origins, not only of life, but the universe as well, in cosmology, you're bound to deal with really sort of severe cases of underdetermination of your theories by the evidence. And that's sort of the game, how the game is played. It's not transient as it is, usually I would argue in, say, physics or at least some areas of fundamental physics. But that's what, in a way, makes it interesting philosophically and in general, intellectually, that really you have to be very careful about the assumptions and about the interpretations, and that a piece of evidence which is in a way sort of meager can be interpreted in very different ways. And sort of the progress is bound to be slow, I guess. So that sort of brings us to the question of kind of inherently philosophical aspect of the sort of the issue of the origin of life and the search for life in other parts of the universe. One thing as far as the life on Earth goes, one thing that sort of really is kind of immediately clear is that we will never really have the kind of evidence about the origin of life and sort of the first sort of period of the development of life on Earth that we would like to have, not even close, right? So it will be always a kind of a speculative, in a way, way of dealing with this question. But then on the other hand, and that's what we, I guess, like in philosophy, is that when you try to do that, you actually learn a lot, because you have all sorts of, you have to devise all sorts of interesting theories and so on. So it strikes me that's one of the inherently philosophical aspects of the search for the origin of life. And then also, we really have to kind of look at the kind of conceptual limitations of the sort of basic concepts that define the subject matter, which is not always really the case. Is there anything else that sort of should be very interesting to philosophers that it hasn't been really in the focus as far as the subject of the origin of life and astrobiology goes? Do you think, Emily, maybe if?
Yeah, well, I think there are a few. So one thing I'm not a metaphysician, and when I started working on this topic, I thought I could do it without really getting into metaphysics. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that one ends up getting into kind of deep metaphysical questions. So there's one thing that's been a topic of debate in the literature on the nature of life just in the last 5 or so years has been, is life a kind or an individual? What are we trying to explain? So most of the literature on this discussion since Aristotle, more or less, has talked about life as if it's a kind of thing that we can define or characterize or what have you. A few people recently have argued that life is actually an individual in the same sort of way that we can think of species like Homo sapiens as individuals. Their lineages, they might be similar to or unlike other individuals, but the idea there is that life on Earth just might be an individual instance of something. There might be others, but it's not the sort of thing we can define or characterize. So I'm kind of sympathetic to ideas on both sides of that debate and not totally sure where I stand, but it's an interesting question that's come up. Another question I'm interested in that's a related sort of question that digs into the metaphysics of life and relates to the sort of major division and origin of life research is to what extent are the origin of living things and the origin of Darwinian evolution two sides of the same coin or separate origin questions? Are we trying to explain the origin of an entity, a new kind of entity that didn't exist in the world before, or a new kind of process, or both at once? So many people seem to run those together into two parts of the same question, and then we can argue about which came first, the replicators or their metabolism. But I think there are some interesting questions there about to what extent those are separable or necessarily intertwined questions.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's very interesting. Milan, do you have anything?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, that's especially the first part of the issue, individual versus kind. Actually, I do think we have fairly strong reasons to believe that we should consider very seriously the idea that the biosphere itself is an entity, so that we actually should treat, and I think that it is quite justified that much maligned and, in my view, unfairly, usually, Gaia hypothesis has gradually returned to the fore in many discussions, I mean, which I think is completely justifiable because actually Gaia hypothesis was very prescient when it appeared, and so actually it enabled us and enables us right now to formulate interesting astrobiological research programs which actually probe a kind of corners, or if you want, some kind of a borderlands of the parameter space, which is of interest to researchers in very practical terms. I mean, this is I would just point out that there were some okay, the work, for instance, the study of Copra and Lineweaver, which was published in 2016, was extremely is extremely interesting and inspirational for all of us doing any work in astrobiology, because actually it pointed out a very simple fact that we might actually expect to have many completely perfectly habitable planets which are empty of life and which are uninhabited, simply because those windows of opportunity which characterized some early epochs in evolution of any biospheres were simply not, I mean, there wasn't some factor prevented evolution to go through those keyholes or windows of opportunity and to spread and to, you know, to become a permanent feature of that habitable planets. So actually this is, there are very interesting ideas in how that relates to various things, to the rare earth hypothesis, to what are maximum and minimal stress from the abiotic environment on early biospheres, on how, for instance, catastrophic events like explosions of supernovae and gamma bursts and other things constrain the early evolution of life. All those things actually kind of lead us to consider biospheres as a kind of units. And also there is a very interesting work by Fort Doolittle on biospheric selection. Actually, because exactly, because his argument that we simply don't need to have reproduction in all cases to be able to speak about selection, at least formally, as a kind of change in relative frequency of particular character or allele, if you wish. That's one thing, and the other thing is when you add any kind of panspermia or any kind of possibility of one biosphere playing a causal role in emergence of any other biosphere, no matter how exactly does that occur. I mean, is it some kind of very low-key transfer of microbiota via lithopanspermia or via some other classical mechanisms, or even some kind of intentional, you know, I mean, after all, it is quite possible that humans have already spread life to other celestial bodies. I mean, I wouldn't exclude that. I mean, I think that probably, although the Office of Planetary Contamination or Planetary Protection actually tries to sterilize our spacecraft, I don't think that they can do it really. So actually it is, in my view, quite possible that we have already inadvertently and perhaps unwittingly spread our terrestrial microorganisms to, for instance, Mars and other celestial bodies.
In July, actually, we had a conference, and one of the keynotes was for Doolittle, and it was fairly obvious in sort of conversations that the sort of Gaia theory and the controversy that sort of engulfed it at the beginning, I mean, the way of sort of, it went a long way in terms of the reconciliation or kind of symbiosis between the Gaia sort of theory and its importance, and sort of kind of a very original sort of angle on things with the evolutionary theory. I mean, it's not anymore sort of as controversial, I would say. Since we mentioned actually Gaia, one of the first pages of that little book, there's a very nice fragment that usually people don't discuss, and that's where, I mean, I'll just sort of summarize. Basically, Lovelock is asking whether we are really equipped, I mean, the way, sort of the easiness with which we recognize life on Earth, all sorts of very different life forms, is really kind of an adaptation, right? Evolutionary kind of a development that our perception and, you know, our cognitive apparatus and sort of a combination of these two are really sort of very nicely adjusted to recognize life. And in a way, and that's also sort of very philosophical kind of a aspect of the whole thing, is that we really need to get out of that sort of almost a priori kind of a framework of recognizing life and thinking about life in order to, you know, begin asking maybe these deeper questions that we strive to ask in astrobiology. And I'm not quite sure that people realize how difficult that might be, actually. I mean, if you think, what comes to mind is Kant and his idea of, you know, space as an a priori perception and concept, and then, you know, 30 years later there's non-Euclidean geometries that are discovered sort of independently by at least 3 people. So it seems to me that's what might happen actually in this kind of a search in astrobiology, that we are not even conceiving of what we are supposed to, in which direction we are supposed to think. But this is a very metaphysical way of putting it in a sense. So I'm not sure that that will be helpful. We'll see. So one of the questions that I mean, Emily, you sort of discuss in your in your paper is you really try to kind of summarize all these very different approaches to life, to the origin of life, and they are very different in terms of the focus. You know, whether people are thinking about the sort of early molecules, how these fairly simple molecules turned into something that we then recognize as life, and you know, Darwinian process of evolution started, and so on, and then you know, it's really very diverse group of theories. That's really clear. So how would you actually go about, you know, kind of tidying up and sort of tying all these different theories into something operational, in a way helpful, you know, to the new researchers or philosophers too?
In the paper, I wasn't so much trying to impose order on theories of the origin of life as such, but more on different approaches to answering the question, what is life, and ways that might track or not track different agendas in origin of life research. So lots of people have come up with these categorization schemes for ways of characterizing life, and most of those focus on the content of different answers to the question, what is life? So is it thermodynamic or metabolic or Darwinian and so forth? So what I'm trying to do in this current work is look at, rather than the content of answers, what are different strategies or commitments that we might make in answering the question, what is life? So I talk about 4 in the paper, but one of them is kind of where you just left off and what you were talking about a moment ago, which is, are we treating life as an individual or as a collective? So many characterizations of life are trying to characterize individuals and focusing on features like metabolism at the organism level. And others are trying to characterize collectives of living things and focusing on features like evolution, change over time, and so forth. So separating these two, are we looking for individual life forms or evidence of evolution of living systems, might make a big difference in the way that we approach looking for life on another planet, as you were saying, Milan. And origin of life research might at least sometimes treat these as part of the same puzzle. And so the other 3 sort of dimensions of this space, one is, are we treating the answer to the question, what is life, as a dichotomy or as a matter of degree? So attempts to strictly define life treat it as a dichotomy. They say, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for life? Those will allow me to draw a line between the living and the non-living. And a number of other answers to the question, what is life, have treated it explicitly as a matter of degree, where we have conditions for what's living and we have paradigm non-living things, and there's just going to be gray area in between. And I think those sorts of matter of degree accounts resonate more with the way people actually think about the origin of life as I understand it. We can argue about whether there was some moment past which there was life and before which there wasn't, but really it's a transition with many dimensions. And so a third one is treating life materially or functionally. Some characterizations of life focus on particular biochemistry, and some are purely functional, many of the Darwinian ones, for example. So I think this can make a difference to questions in origin of life research, because to the extent that origin of life researchers are focused only on what I'd call a how actually question, which is how did life in fact originate on Earth 4 billion years ago, they might have good reasons to prioritize material characterizations of life, which are closely tied to the biochemistry of life as we know it. But I think many origin of life researchers are interested in a bigger question, which is more of a how possibly question, which is an umbrella for the first question. How could life originate anywhere at any point in time? And in those cases, maybe something more functional is appropriate. And then the last one is thinking about life minimally versus inclusively. So we might be just trying to characterize minimal life, as many researchers do. What are the conditions for minimal chemical life or a minimal protocell? And that's the focus of many answers to the question, what is life, in origin of life research. And in other fields, people are trying to characterize life more inclusively to include everything from protocells to everything you see alive today.
Yeah, that distinction, how actually, like the actual and possible sort of definition, what are you really trying to accomplish, I think is very, very useful, and it's so great. And another question that is related to this sort of a gray area of, the cutoff line between living and non-living. I mean, once you start thinking or reading about the beginning or sort of theories of the beginning of life and whatever we have of the kind of indications, I would say, if not evidence, of these early sort of moments, I mean, it's fairly obvious that you can't really draw a clear line in any sense that you would claim is kind of a general and sort of, goes across kind of all the accounts and theories. But then on the other hand, a really tedious philosopher would ask, well, what are you trying to explain then? If you don't know where that transition actually happens, if you don't know where these non-living molecules turn into something that really is actually life. I mean, shouldn't that be kind of a part of the explanation when you're trying to come up with the theory of abiogenesis or abiogenetic sort of beginnings of life? So it is a very kind of a specific, I would say, problem. And one sort of a response, I mean, I'm interested in what you two actually think about it. One of the responses that it's kind of easy way out would be something along the lines of what Daniel Dennett talked about when he talked about the mind, like this kind of continuum from thermostat to a human being, right? You get these kind of incremental changes, and really you need like the characteristics that thermostat has in order to sort of qualify the human mind, but it happens somewhere along the continuum of this transition. It's fine, but when you come up with the theory, I mean, are you as a researcher obliged to actually kind of draw the line at some point? What do you think?
I don't think that we are anywhere near that point that we can isolate. I mean, to continue your metaphor, I mean, I think we can isolate some kind of points on the line and maybe some immediate environments of each point, but I mean, we are very far from achieving a true understanding of the whole spectrum of transitions which is necessary for that. So actually we can isolate some interesting points which are interesting from, again, our limited, our arguably anthropocentric and geocentric point of view, and then investigate their environments and then see, perhaps in some very speculative manner, how we can join one environment of one point to the environment of the other point. And this is the best we can do at the moment. Probably one day when we have better insight into conditions on other, at least formally habitable planets, which is not that far away. I mean, there are many ongoing projects which are actually offer quite a reasonable expectation of at least carving out some parts of the parameter space in terms of our search for biosignatures. In the next, I think, decade or two, there are several space-based missions which are very promising. I think we'll have much better insight into that. Perhaps we can then go, and of course, I mean, if some great theoretical breakthrough occurs in a kind of foundational studies, I mean, I don't know, maybe perhaps Emily can tell us more about whether it is reasonable to expect from an epistemological point of view to have a kind of deep theoretical breakthrough in our understanding of what life is on a microscopic level.
So, Emily, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree that, so I understand the sort of hypothetical philosopher's pull to want to have a clear line, but our characterization of life is a moving target, as we've discussed, and I think it's going to be multidimensional to some extent. There's currently many criteria that people have proposed, and maybe as we learn more, we'll refine it down to a shorter list. But there are already, I think, pretty nice, clear cases of borderlines for our understanding of life that should be thought of as gray areas. So viruses, people like to argue about whether viruses are alive or not. And I think the right answer is it depends on your criteria, and maybe the best answer is they're in between. They're at this fuzzy borderline. There are some criteria that we can say yes or no to. Do they have DNA or RNA? But others just lead us to borderlines. Many people think reproduction is an important criterion for life. And if we think about viruses, they don't exactly do it under their own steam, but they do when infecting a host. So yeah, the idea of borderlines shouldn't be especially puzzling, even just looking at life as we know it and related phenomena. So I think it makes sense that an understanding of the origin of life will involve sort of transitional borderline stages. And it's also, I mean, a quite fruitful approach in some discussions in philosophy of science and philosophy of biology in the last few decades has been thinking about things in terms of multidimensional spaces, where instead of defining a concept, we just have a space of dimensions that are relevant to our understanding of that concept, and things occupy that space without drawing super hard lines within it. So Sandra Mitchell's discussion of laws of nature and Peter Godfrey Smith's discussion of Darwinian populations, and Jonathan Birch has some more recent work in a similar sort of vein on sentience. So I think some of these tricky concepts are probably best understood in terms of several dimensions of characterization and various matters of degree in that space.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I sort of asked this question, not that I am that kind of a tedious philosopher, or I hope I'm not, but just to sort of, it's good to kind of clarify, to pose it in order to sort of clarify all these conceptual sort of distinctions. Now, I mean, if you have any sort of ideas or any questions that we didn't really touch on, we actually touched a lot, I would say, in this fairly short period of time. But if you have any, I mean...
Actually, I have a question. I have a question for you too, I mean, which might be interesting, and I mean, a kind of, again, devil's advocate question. Suppose at the time when, okay, let me return for a second again to the Viking mission. At the time of conceptualizing and launching Vikings, there wasn't really serious philosophy of biology, if I remember well. There was some, like David Hall and some other early pioneers, but there wasn't. Suppose that there is a kind of a new Viking mission right now, and somebody asks you whether to invest in modern day terms, like $10 billion, for instance, into a mission which will go to, for instance, I don't know, Titan, and search for simple microbial life. So what will, in your opinion, be a relevant input, if any, but I hope there is a relevant input on the part of philosophy of biology to answer that question? Suppose you are summoned to some kind of a grand panel by NASA or ESA or whoever. So what will you think about what the difference in last like 40 years of work in philosophy of biology now enables us to be better than people who constructed Viking?
Well, I mean, I'll turn to Emily actually to respond to this difficult question quickly, but I mean, the problem is that, I mean, I can say a few things, of course, like especially understanding of individuality and the way in which we understand different kind of layers or levels, is more popular term, at which life manifests itself. But I mean, we mentioned at the beginning, really the philosophers of biology have been kind of really focused on evolutionary theory and the details of the conceptual framework that of the evolutionary theory. So all these debates are quite new in philosophy of biology, I would say, and fairly recent, and not many people are actually working on that. So what I would suggest, instead of answering immediately these kinds of questions, is to speed up that sort of a stream within philosophy of biology, and then come back in about 10 or 15 years with the panel of philosophers of biology with concrete proposals, which missions actually to finance and which missions, you know, to dump. Okay, that was a roundabout way of doing. Maybe I think Emily will do better with these questions. So do you have any thoughts?
I mean, yeah, it's a fascinating question. I think maybe one thing that's relevant is just coming back to what you were already saying about the Viking mission and the enduring at least some degree of controversy with, as you said, at least 2 people still saying they did find life. As I understand it, what happened there was a hypothesis and a series of experiments designed around it, and a result, and then people argued about how to interpret the result. It was all framed with a working assumption about life in the background, and then there was argument about whether or not the results that were found were due to contamination and so forth. But even if we settled all those questions, there were still questions about whether the working assumption about life was the right assumption about life. And I think with the sort of philosophical insight that we now have on the debate about life, and I'm not saying that comes just from philosophers. Philosophers have contributed, but a lot of scientists are involved in that philosophical progress too. I think going into these sorts of missions with a broader set of the landscape of ways to address the question about life in mind, and keeping clearly in mind that we don't have a single answer to that question, but rather a landscape of answers, and then asking, how do the results that we're collecting fit into that landscape? So Carol Cleland talks about this in terms of suggesting that astrobiologists have tentative criteria for life in mind rather than definitions, which I think captures this idea of more broadly characterizing life, as I was calling it earlier. But part of the idea there is, I think, if we go in with this landscape of different answers to the question, what is life, both in the content sense and in the sense that I was talking about earlier, are we looking for an individual or a collective? Are we looking for minimal evidence of something tiny and microbial, or some sort of inclusive, rich biosphere? And maybe doing several different experiments and being clear about how they all fit in with that landscape might lead to more satisfying answers, even if I'm skeptical that any mission could find anything today and come back and say, look, we found life, and everyone in the world would say, great, you found life, we all agree. But I think being clear about that landscape and the fact that it's currently a landscape is a good starting point.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it is. I mean, and one thing that I was just half jokingly saying about the philosophers of biology, sort of starting to, you know, they should gather, and I mean that kind of work I think is valuable, having in mind very concrete actually possibilities of testing, and that's probably when philosophers of science are at its best in a way, sort of coming up with this kind of a conceptual landscape, looking at life across sort of time and kind of various levels at which it exists, and then trying to formulate the sort of mission goals, or, you know, the kind of various possibilities, starting actually from there. That's sort of, you know, what we should have in mind in a sort of a future work, I guess. I mean, of course, you two already have that in mind, but you know, generally speaking, as far as the discipline really goes, it's very exciting actually field. Probably one of very few most exciting fields in philosophy of science in general, and kind of an intersection, a fruitful intersection of science and philosophy, I think. Very kind of unforced, but like very natural. So I think that about wraps it up, I guess. Emily, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think we should go on. We could go on for like a couple of hours like this, but you know, there are limitations in life, concrete limitations. So thank you very much again. So if we have any other activities of a similar sort, we'll certainly let you know.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks. Yeah, well, it was great meeting you both, and hope to get to talk more about this in the future.
Yes, maybe live at some point in the future, in the distant future.